the newsagents.
It's a special question and answer session.
End of summer.
End of summer.
Yay.
Yay.
Actually, not yay that it's end of summer, but yay for the Q&A.
Yay for the Q&A. This is from Mark. It sounded like you both had a great time in Chicago.
No,
Mark, it was work. It was work, mate.
It was awful.
Awful. Have you put your requests in for where you'll be sent in November? If so, which state will be the most interesting battleground to cover this election?
Now, a lot of people wouldn't think this, but, it's important sometimes to come at things from a different angle. I actually think there is every chance Hawaii could go Republican this time. Trump, very, very popular. And so, Honolulu, look, I'm willing to do it, John. You know what I mean?
Mate,
I know.
Mate, what a man. You're
honestly,
taking one for the team.
Taking several for the team. And I hear you're off to Anchorage in Alaska. How fantastic. Nothing. I tell you, I hear Anchorage in the early winter is delightful.
Yeah, Lewis, you're never going to get to Hawaii.
Why can't it be a swing state? For Christ's sake, come on, Honolulu.
Exactly. I guess the one that I want to keep an eye on, because I just think it would be so extraordinary, would be Florida. If Florida suddenly comes into play. Because, if you looked at the last governor's election there, when Ron DeSantis absolutely won it by a country mile, you'd think there's not a cat's chance in hell that the Democrats could do it. And all the demographics were pointing in one direction, that it was just now a safe Republican state. Actually, because of abortion law changes, because of a few other factors, it is conceivable that Florida comes back into play. And I just think that that would be a really interesting state if that were one that was suddenly a battleground state.
So American political analysts like to talk about tipping point states, i.e. the states that if they, or even just one state, that if it falls to one side or another, basically the election's over. And I think you can credibly argue that there are two tipping point states, one for each side, i.e. a state that without it, it becomes nearly impossible for that side to win. The one for Kamala Harris and the Democrats is Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
The Electoral College just doesn't really work without its 19 electoral votes. And likewise, Georgia, which of course went for Biden in 2020, for the first time for any Democrat since 92. For Trump, if he can't win Georgia, then again, the electoral map just doesn't really add up. So if you're looking for two states that will be absolutely pivotal, then Pennsylvania and Georgia are the two. Georgia's slightly better weather in November, of course, so,
Yeah,
we can discuss that.
And Tim Walz and Kamala Harris have been on a 2-day bus tour in southern Georgia for the past couple of days, because they think that this is in play. Now, it may be a feint, if you like, just to try to force the Republicans to spend even more money in the state, because the more money you put into one state, the less you've got for another. But it looks like the Democrats now believe that Georgia is in play.
And Hawaii.
And
Aloha. Aloha. Can you
Lewis,
say that?
It's not going to happen.
Okay.
It's not going to happen.
Should we get on with the main show?
Welcome to the News Agents. It's John.
It's Lewis.
And Lewis is not going to Hawaii just for the so there's no doubt whatsoever. Let us start, though, with a question from Gemma. A question for Jon and Lewis. I've heard it mentioned in passing a few times whilst you were in Chicago that Biden and Obama have a complex relationship. What is behind this?
The bromance.
The bromance was always complicated.
More complicated than it often appeared. I think that's the point.
Completely. Yeah. And, you've got to go back to think that in 2008, when Obama won the Democratic nomination, Biden ran, failed, beaten by Obama.
Like beaten terribly, got nowhere.
Like smashed. And there's something of, I don't know if you've seen the film Amadeus, but there is something of the relationship between Mozart, the genius, young, and Salieri, the sort of toiling, older, less capable musician. And there's an element of that in Obama and Biden.
Sopel and Goodall.
So predictable. So predictable.
Oh, but no wonder people don't like.
But do you remember kind of a few months ago, we were talking about how Joe Biden had managed these confidential documents that he'd stored in his garage in Delaware. And then he goes to see this special counsel, her, and gives evidence, which has now been published. And apropos of nothing, Joe Biden starts talking about how the 2016 election and how Obama had backed Hillary to be the Democratic nominee and not Biden. Yeah. And it clearly rankled with him that, Obama never really appreciated him. And there are all sorts of stories how in recent times, Biden has got a bit of legislation through and said, I bet Obama's jealous that he couldn't do that. I just think he is slightly obsessed by having been for so long in the shadow of Barack Obama, this hugely gifted, talented politician.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's clear that they did become genuinely close in lots of ways while they were in the White House. They did have a much closer presidential, vice presidential relationship than a lot of presidents and vice presidents have. You know, he had real input. Obama did value his foreign policy expertise, which he'd built up over many years in the Senate. He did value his ability and his relationships on Capitol Hill, which Obama never much enjoyed. You know, Biden, as we've seen as president, he loves LBJ, like, you know, to get down and dirty about legislation, arm twisting, talking to senators, talking to Congress people. But Obama was a much more aloof figure than that. He didn't enjoy it. So they did become close. But I think there are two things at play, right? John, you talked about one of them, which is Obama talking him out of standing in 2016. Partly Obama said because his son had just died and he didn't want to see him do that, but also because it was clear that Obama thought Hillary would be the better candidate. And, you know, as eventually we saw, it was Biden who beat Trump, not Hillary. And Biden, the people around Biden, believe that had he stood, he would have beaten Trump in 2016 and spared the country the sort of toxin of the Trump presidency and the ongoing Trump presence that presumably he wouldn't have stood again. And there's another bit of it to the Biden psychology as well, right? Which is a bit like Trump in some ways, right? He is, as we know, he considers himself the boy from Scranton, and he has always believed that Democratic Party elites and political elites in DC generally have always looked down on him, have always thought he was a little bit uncouth by comparison to them, not as smart, not as clever, and he talks about this all the time. And I think he thinks that the very professorial Obama,
the embodiment of that is Barack Obama.
Yeah, in a way, and that all plays into it. So you've got just these really complicated relationships and psychologies at play, and I'm sure Obama would see it very differently. But it's a fascinating relationship, and now you add on to that the fact that Obama has not been there for him during this period, and doubtless that resentment will fester.
Exactly, and that was peak vulnerability for Joe Biden, wasn't it? That moment when people are saying, he's too old, he's too old, he's too old. And who would be the voice that would sort of let it be known publicly that he was sort of leading that charge, but Barack Obama? And I think that all combines to make the relationship incredibly complicated. And it was really noticeable that in Michelle Obama's electric speech that she delivered in Chicago, not a mention of Joe Biden. Now, why did she have to mention Joe Biden? No. She was doing a different kind of speech.
She could have done, though. Just one sentence.
But she could have done. And, Michelle Obama is sophisticated political operative enough to know that would have just been, you're ticking the box of thank you, Joe, thank you, Joe, we think you're marvellous, goodbye. She didn't even make any reference to him whatsoever. And so I kind of do think that the Obama-Biden relationship has been fascinating, but very troubled right now.
We have got a voice note now from Ollie.
Hi, it's Ollie from Warwickshire. I have a question about the US election. In January 2001, Al Gore, as Vice President and therefore President of the Senate, oversaw the voting and certification of the election result where he lost to George W. Bush. This was the same role that Mike Pence took in 2021, and we know how that ended. So, given everything, do you think Kamala Harris will actually take on this role in January 2025, or do you think they'll have to do something different?
Great question. I think you did that all in one breath. I could hardly heard a pause there. It was beautiful. I wish I could do that.
It's the Lewis Goodall approach. I think it's quite simple, isn't it? I mean, Harris will certainly, one way or the other, oversee the certification as vice president, whether it's for herself, which is quite a rare occurrence, or indeed if for the Trump ticket. I mean, she would have to very much grin and bear it. It would be a pretty unpleasant experience, but she would do it. I think the bigger question is if J.D. Vance were vice president, would he do the same? And the bigger question for this immediate election is whether the House of Representatives itself, with the Speaker, because it's the sort of two-man job, the Vice President and the Speaker of the House, who is, of course, a Republican, Mike Johnson. And the bigger question is whether he will be willing to oversee it and have support from his caucus to oversee it, and if the election is seen to be legitimate, whether he will oversee its certification the same way. Because you remember, if you go back to 2020, at that time you had a Democratic House with Nancy Pelosi overseeing the certification, and Mike Pence, who, as we know, was a Republican, but that was the line in the sand for him, and he did play his part rightly in the constitutional processes. So I think there are bigger questions, not so much about what Harris does for this election, but about Mike Johnson and the House of Representatives?
Absolutely, 100%. I believe that Kamala Harris would certify Donald Trump's victory if it's seen that he has won fair and square, because I think that the Democrats would not want to be in the same position that the Republicans were in 2020, 2021. Back then, it's worth underlining that even though there had been no evidence that had ever been stood up by any of the constitutional means, i.e., individual secretaries of state or in the courts, 174 Republican congressmen and women voted not to certify Joe Biden's victory.
Exactly.
Which is just astonishing. I think this time round it will be different. And it will be different for this reason. If Trump is seen to have lost again in a broadly speaking free and fair election, they will know that age 78, Trump is finished. MAGA may not be finished. The influence of Trump may not be finished. But the damage that Donald Trump could impose on them will be much more limited than it was in 2020 when he had been the president. And I don't think there will be the same fear factor. And I think that even some of these, the swivel-eyed Republicans, no, they will kind of go to the last ditch and die in the last ditch for Donald Trump. But others, I think, suffered Donald Trump, know how intimidating he can be. But I think if Trump loses again, they'll say, you know what? We're done with this.
I think that's right, but I think that is why Democrats feel that the margin needs to be significant.
Yeah.
Because if the margin's significant, as it was in 2020, there's no arguing. I think the nightmare scenario, the real nightmare scenario, is if, as we were talking about in the first question, if this really does just come down to one state, Erie County,
and a few thousand votes.
Erie County in Pennsylvania, or Fulton County in Atlanta, or in Georgia, or wherever it happens to be, and you're talking about a few thousand votes. And by the way, during this period, the whole MAGA process has been, sort of conspiracy has been getting underway to replace a lot of the election officials who actually saved the legitimacy of the election in 2020 and replacing them with Republicans who believe in the big lie and introducing lots of extra processes this time, which could stymie the result or slow the result. Then, you could imagine a situation in which actually there is constitutional confusion and there is no clear way forward that ultimately ends up in the Supreme Court, as it did in 2000. Difference now is it's not a split court. It's a court dominated by conservative Republicans, many of whom are appointed by Trump himself. Right, we've got an email here from Tom, who has said, hi, newsagents, really enjoyed your coverage of the DNC last week. The party conference season, though, is nearly upon us, although I think you'll be disappointed there'll be no Oprah and balloons there, guys. Well, we don't know, Tom. You don't know. I hear Oprah thinks Liverpool's lovely at this time of year. Do you think there is anything...
100,000 balloons came down.
I was thinking we were there. Someone had to clean that up,
100,000 balloons came down, and I read a whole press release not to be used, embargoed until release of the balloon.
Right.
Of how many people it took to blow up 100,000 balloons, what efforts had to be put in place, the machinery. I thought, oh God, who cares about this bloody press release?
Tom says, do you think there is anything that our political parties in Britain could learn from the DNC convention and the RNC when it comes to their party conferences? Is there anything that our political parties should replicate, Tom, in Leatherhead? Well, the balloons.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. I can't quite see a Starmer. Oh, look at these lovely balloons.
The thing is that American politics is different. And I kept on getting messages from sort of family and friends, saying last week, I'm loving the conference, but God, some of it is really sick making. Yeah. A lot of it is about how I grew up. I was a middle class. There's a lot of narrative arc of these conferences where people make it very personal and they all tell their stories, and I think it's all a little bit mawkish, a little bit saccharine, a little bit over the top for British tastes. So you can't transpose that. But I do think that in the production of a convention, there is stuff that the party conferences could lose. I remember being at Tory party conferences where we're now going to a debate on transport. And up steps the Transport Secretary who says, well, first of all, I'd like to thank our Minister of State at the Department of Transport, our Minister in the House of Lords. And you think, oh, my God, how much longer is this dreariness going to go on? And I think that, if you are thinking that politics is in a small way a branch of entertainment, then it's no bad thing to put a bit of entertainment in.
Yeah, I suppose we have to remember that although on the surface, you might think these are kind of similar events. In many ways, they are completely different, and they have a completely different purpose, right? A convention, the reason it only happens every 4 years is because it is there to nominate one person, or specifically two people, for president and vice president. That is its primary function. Its secondary function is as a media event. It's part of the electoral campaign calendar, the countdown to the election itself. And third, it's just a massive money raiser. It's there for party funding. British Party Conference is a bit different. They are there, particularly for the Labour Party and the Lib Dems. They have a constitutional function. They have to authorise and to actually develop policy, and it's put to a vote, and so there are constitutional functions that have to be exercised. They are far less, and there is a money-making function to them. Indeed, political parties rely on them for fundraising and to remain solvent for all sorts of reasons and ways. But they're far more kind of workmanlike processes for the party itself, rather than being part of a campaign calendar. So that is why they are less schmaltzy, less glitzy, less geared towards the TV networks, and indeed they take place in the middle of the day, which is good for sort of journalistic drinking, but less good for in terms of getting anyone to watch the things, than it would be an American convention. So they are, although, as I say, superficially similar, actually very different in function.
Yeah, I remember during the Blair years there was attempts to sort of try and glitz it up. I remember Bono coming to speak at a Labour Party conference, and obviously the most famous one when Bill Clinton came to the Labour Party
Went
conference
to McDonald's,
in
famously.
Blackpool, and turns up at McDonald's, and there are all sorts of amazing stories about Clinton and up playing cards until about 4
Kevin
o'clock in the
Spacey,
morning.
wasn't it? Is that right?
Yeah. Well, let's draw a veil over that. But yeah, so there have been those moments where you've brought in the big name speakers and the big entertainers, and but by and large they are
humdrum.
Yeah, ours are business-like, and I just don't think the papers would say, "Oh, this is terrible," and you're just borrowing from America, and you haven't really got any ideas. This should be about politics and not about entertainment.
Although this year's Conservative Party conference will have almost a sort of feeling of a brokered American convention in a little way. In a
beauty
small way.
parade.
A beauty parade, because a bit like what they did in 2005, they're going to have all of the leadership candidates basically making auditions or doing auditions for the leadership before the members. So it will have this year's Tory conference, although a bit of a wake for obvious reasons, will have a different feel to it.
Let us move on. Sharon has a question. I heard a statistic on your podcast stating that no matter who is running for president in the US elections, each party always gets around 45% of the vote. This astounds me when you consider Trump, especially in his current state of perpetual meltdown. Do you think this time there is more of a possibility than in previous elections that a substantial number of die-hard Republicans who can't bring themselves to vote for the Democrats on principle will just choose not to vote?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that America has always had pretty much, a couple of exceptions, a two-party system. And that system is deeply, deeply embedded. So, although it might seem peculiar to us, a country which has traditionally had a two-party system, but in many ways now has a deeply embedded multi-party system, like many European countries, it is so woven into the kind of fabric, the warp and weft of American politics, that a two-party system does produce a highly polarized electorate. So even in quite substantial electoral college margin victories, so if you think back to sort of Obama in 2008, 2012, for example, we're still talking about a percentage of the vote difference of about 51 to 49% or 52 to 48% between Obama and Romney. Very narrow if you look at it nationally. So even if you go back to the biggest
What about
victories
Reagan 84?
So Reagan 84, I think, is more in the margin of between 55 and 60. I think the biggest ever, LBJ was over 60%. FDR, I think, in his first or second election was over 60%. But even then, it's still 60-40. So even in absolute wipeout territory against people like, I don't know, Dewey for FDR or someone like that, or LBJ with Barry Goldwater in 64, you're still talking about 40% of the electorate-ish still going for that candidate, even if you look at the electoral college map and it's a sea of blue or a sea of red or whatever it happens to be. So I think we have to just remember that. And indeed, one of the explanations for 2016, I remember everyone saying, you'll remember it better than me, John, but one of the sort of themes in the run-up to the election was like, this is going to be a really unusual election because you're going to have all these Republicans who can't stomach Trump and they're going to vote for Hillary instead. And of course, actually what happened is that Trump in many ways polled just as a kind of generic Republican candidate. He did pretty much as well with normal type Republican voters as you would expect, because they were just turning out for the Republican. And what he did is max out a slightly newer coalition of non-college educated white voters, and that's what led to his electoral college victory in 16. But, you're talking about a highly polarized electorate who deeply, deeply fear, and I mean existentially fear, the other side. And in that circumstance, that is why you always end up with about 45 or so % of the electorate who's always going to vote one way, of those who vote, of course.
Yeah, and Sharon, I mean, you could flip your question around the other way. There will be just as many Republicans who think that the Republic will end if there is another Democratic Party victory.
Yeah, they really believe that.
They are so convinced that the Democrats are evil, that there will be, that America will become a Marxist state, because there'll be things like, oh my God, healthcare. Can you imagine that? Free healthcare for everyone, because that's what the Democrats might do. And, on the whole kind of demonization of the diversity, equity and inclusion agenda, DEI, which are kind of buzzwords that are flying around now. And then you add to that the culture wars. The Democrats will take away our guns. The Democrats will kind of, there'll be gay marriage everywhere. The whole trans debate will be transformed. And therefore, if we want to preserve all that is good and all that is decent in America, we have to vote Republican, even if we don't like Donald Trump. And as you said, Lewis, the really significant thing about 2016 was that the reason the pollsters got it wrong was not because of the sort of Republicans who'd always voted Republican and would they or wouldn't they. It was that Donald Trump managed to get a whole load of people to register to vote who had been off the grid, who had just simply said, I don't want to have anything to do with politics, hadn't voted in successive elections, and they suddenly came back to vote for Donald Trump. And that is why, in large part, the polling organisations got it wrong. I mean, Hillary Clinton kind of said after 2016, I got 3 million more votes than he did. Therefore, I should have won. No, you play by the rules that are there. The rules are the Electoral College. The only thing that matters is getting to 270 Electoral College votes, and that's how you do it. And as Lewis said, there is no real third party. There's no SNP that affects national share of the vote. There's no Plaid. There's no Northern Ireland parties. It is Democrats versus Republicans for the most part, with odd, a Green candidate here, a Ross Perot there, a Robert F. Kennedy Jr., although he's now pulling out somewhere else.
I think you also have to remember the thing which is never far away from the surface of American politics, which is race, right? You've alluded to it, John, a little bit already, but you've got to remember that certainly it's been declining a bit in recent elections, but still largely racial groups tend to, particularly minorities, have tended to vote quite monolithically, particularly black voters, for example. I mean, the Democratic Party, even though, as I say, it's been slipping a little bit, still attracting, plus 85% of the black vote in a way that they used to vote Republican many, many, many decades ago. Likewise, whites, particularly non-college educated whites, voting, monolithically for the Republicans. This is a society in that circumstance where racial fear and racial tension is profound and significant. And when you have got racial groups which genuinely fear the consequences for them as a racial group or block of the other side getting in, not because their own side is telling them this is going to be really bad, sometimes very, very explicitly, sometimes implicitly, particularly with Republicans and white voters, then you do tend to get people voting together and always voting in one way, in a way that is there in British politics to some extent, but to a far lesser extent than the United States.
We'll be back after the break with some questions closer to home.
Right, we've got a question via Threads from Andrew, who has said this. Labour promise growth, in quotation marks, but don't define how it will be measured. Do you think they mean an increase in GDP per capita or something else? Andrew, I've actually asked various Labour ministers about this, including Pat McFadden, who is obviously very senior, and they are always rather vague. Because, you could do, as I said to him, you could imagine a situation in which Labour, if all you want is growth, you could just get growth at the very top, i.e. you could just get the top income deciles gaining in terms of income, and it could all just be in one place in the southeast or London, but that wouldn't seem very satisfactory. The only commitment they will really go to, as Pat McFadden was saying to me, is they want to see broad-based growth across the country and across the income distributions. They want everyone to be getting better off. But of course, the interesting sort of weird tension about that, and what I remember on my LBC Sunday show pushing McFadden about this, which is that obviously, historically, Labour have always been about the reduction of inequality. That is the sort of fundamental concern of the Labour Party that runs through its DNA, right? But you could imagine, as I say, a situation as in the 1980s where maybe everybody gets richer, but the rich get richer faster. Would that be satisfactory to this Labour Party? And the truth is they haven't really elaborated on any of that. They've said they want wealth creation, they say they want growth, but are far more reluctant to actually get into the details of what that might mean.
Surely you want, I mean, of course, you're absolutely right about the Labour, the Harold Wilson quote, Labour is a moral crusade or it is nothing.
Yeah.
That's what they are there for. That's what they have always sought to do. But isn't it the headline number that you are after? In the Blair years, early years, they managed to kind of achieve that virtuous circle that very few governments had done, which is to have sustainable non-inflationary growth, which had always been the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for British politicians. And, the economy was going along at 2.5% growth with no real inflationary problems. I mean, obviously, they came a lot later after 2008. And isn't that the measure that you'll want to? Because that is also, if you're saying, as Labour have said, that they want the fastest growth in the G7, then that is how it is measured. That's the simple measure of what your growth rate is, how much the economy has grown per year. And if you get 2.5% growth, not as much as America is growing at the moment, certainly not as much as China has been growing, but that would be kind of seen to be a good place to be.
But I think Labour know as well that, you mentioned the American example, that it's all very well having headline growth, but if people don't feel it, then all it is a statistic.
So you have to have
in the Financial Times. And actually, it can be even worse, because as Biden has found, it can be a really difficult thing to navigate politically, to be able to say, no, things are going really well. The economy is growing, GDP's up, and you just sound a bit kind of like one of the old commissars of the Soviet Union talking about how much pig iron is being produced each year, right?
Production.
Exactly, right. So you've got to have a broadly based. I mean, Rachel Reeves has actually stolen the sort of Biden formulation where she's talked about she wants growth from the bottom up and the middle out, right? So that is the kind of formulation they're going with. But what it actually means and the specifics of it are still a little elusive.
Let us go on to Martin in Ealing. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. Since listening to you, I feel like an authority on all matters political, which led to some embarrassment when my partner asked me the following question, and I had to admit that I had absolutely no idea what the answer is. Please help me. Okay, Martin, we are here. The question is, can/do members of the royal family vote in general elections? I would guess that King Charles didn't vote in the recent election, but is this a matter of convention or is there something more formal which prevents him? How far does this extend to other members of the royal family? Thanks in advance for your help.
So the answer is that they do not vote in a general election, and they don't do so more than just convention. Anyone who is in the aristocracy, who's in the House of Lords, historically would not be able to vote. And that is because there are two houses of Parliament, and it would not have been proper, for all sorts of historical reasons we don't need to get into, for a member of one house to be influencing
the permanent
legislature. The permanent legislature, which at one time was more important than was where prime ministers were largely drawn from, the House of Lords, to be influencing or affecting the composition and membership of the lower house. So the king does not vote. I don't think any immediate members of the royal family vote. I'm not sure what the actual cut-off point is, but the senior aristocracy doesn't vote, and no one who is in the House of Lords and accepts a membership of the peerage, they lose their right to vote.
Exactly. And so, if you think about the state opening of Parliament, the king goes to sit in the House of Lords. He is part of the permanent sort of establishment. And the commoners, the members of the House of Commons, are summoned to go to the House of Lords to listen to the king. He belongs in that part of the house, as it were, where the benches are red, not where the benches are green. And so the king and the senior members of the royal family do not vote in elections. They're like certain kind of convicts in prison who also don't get to vote.
Ellie has emailed to say, hi, never miss an episode of the podcast and really appreciate the coverage across a range of issues. I have a question. So the ICC has issued arrest warrants for both Netanyahu and the leader of Hamas for war crimes. I know the Israeli government initially challenged the decision, and Labour here in the UK are no longer supporting that challenge in any way, but why isn't there more urgency in actually arresting them? Well, Ellie, I think one of the reasons for that is simply practical, which is that I'm not sure Netanyahu is going to be leaving Israel anytime soon. If he does, it'll probably be to go to the United States, which is not part of the ICC. And so actually just the sheer practicality of arresting him. If he was to come to the UK now, there would be a very, very awkward moment or set of decisions for the UK to make in terms of whether they do try and prosecute that case. But that is the main reason, or one of the reasons, why he ain't coming to London anytime soon.
I would think that channels at the Foreign Office would say to the Foreign Office, in Israel, not a good idea. This is not the right time to be visiting now because of X. And you can see that although he might not get arrested, and the only kind of arrest that took place in Britain was when General Pinochet, the former leader of Chile, came over, for whom there was an international arrest warrant, and he was arrested, and it kind of led to a huge diplomatic standoff, and Thatcher determined to get him freed because, they had been very close, is that you don't want the diplomatic kind of nightmare of it, but equally, how limiting if you are a world leader who is used to globetrotting, and Netanyahu has been in and out of Downing Street umpteen times over his long political career, how limiting to think that you cannot travel. And I think that has a pretty chill effect on an awful lot of people. I'm sure Netanyahu is deeply conscious, deeply resentful, deeply unhappy that that's the position he now finds himself, as Vladimir Putin is in a similar position.
It's not a happy club. James says, hi news agents, question, that's the idea, James. With the Reform Party being a business rather than a political party, could someone buy the business and therefore control the party and policy? That's an interesting question.
So should we launch a takeover for Reform?
Yes, sure. You, me, Maitlis.
Yeah, a few others.
We'll
chip in a bit.
Yeah. You know what? It is an interesting question. I have to be honest. I don't know for certain off the top of my head. I think, because Reform, as the question, James, you alluded to in the question, it is an unusual setup because it is basically owned, controlled by Nigel Farage directly. It isn't governed like a normal political party. It doesn't have this sort of same political structure as NEC and all those sorts of things. It doesn't have members in the traditional way that a political party would. So it is unusual. I suppose theoretically it is possible that he might be able to sell it, although I don't know what rules would be applicable to it, whether it would be sort of come under corporate rules or whether the Electoral Commission would get involved. It is an unusual party, an unusual setup, but I suppose theoretically it's possible. How do you quantify its assets? Or, say how much it's worth.
Look, you can put whatever value you like on it. It's not like it's kind of, it's not like they are producing numbers where you can say, well, what is the profitability and what was the return on capital, etc., etc. So I think it's an interesting question. Obviously, Farage was just, he doesn't have to sell. You can offer him 10 million, 50 million, 100 million. If he doesn't want that money, he will say, I'm not selling it. He's under no compunction. It's not like there are shareholders that he has to go to. If you're buying a public company, the CEO can recommend to shareholders to reject the offer. But if the shareholders think, hang on, my share that is currently worth £3 would be worth £6 under this offer, I'm voting to sell. It's not like that. So and even if you did buy the Reform Party, what's to stop Farage setting up a company called Reform 2?
Real Reform,
UKIP, Brexit Party, March 75.
This is his third party.
Yeah, exactly.
So it isn't inconceivable. But I'm looking forward to the John Sopel leadership bid for the Reform Party.
It's coming soon.
I can't wait.
I'm just getting all my publicity lined up.
If you join now, then you get a free copy of Strangeland.
Is that a book that I've written coming out very soon?
I thought you were about to say free. I wouldn't have thought so.
No, not free. For goodness sake, you're not getting a free copy anyway.
No, I wouldn't expect it. We'll be back just after this. Right, one final question. Hello, Oscar from Balham and John's fellow Southampton alumnus. Do you know Oscar?
I don't think I do.
Oh. Oh, I was giving the brush off there.
No, I don't. It doesn't ring a bell.
Okay, here with a question for the newsagents and hoping the Q&A episodes will be continued. I'm sure people are quick to make presumptions about your own political views and any potential bias you might have. No, it's never happened, John. No. I wouldn't have thought so, Oscar. How do you navigate speaking to your family and close friends about your own political views? Do you have concerns about these opinions becoming publicly known? For instance, did you have to be careful when discussing with others how you plan to / did vote at the recent general election. Love the show. Well, I mean, obviously, in Emily's case, for the last point, much like members of the royal family, she abstains from voting.
Have you elevated her to the aristocracy?
To the peerage.
To the
Lady Maitlis.
Lady Maitlis.
Baronet. Oh, she'd love that.
I tell you what's funny, which is not quite an answer to your question, but a lot of people had assumed, because we had been very critical of the Conservative government, that we were Labour. And we do the episode, whenever it was, after Keir Starmer's speech in the Rose Garden.
Yes.
And we are quite critical of that. And then we get people saying, oh, so you've got buyer's remorse then? No, we hold people in power to account without fear or favour. And I think that is somewhat different from your own political views.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the political views that I hold, I think I've expressed. Do I think that Brexit has been the most unalloyed success for Britain? No, I don't really. But broadly speaking, in terms of Labour and Conservative, you're just trying to hold people who wield power to account. I had exactly the same thing in America when, throughout the Trump years in my BBC coverage, I had, when there was things to criticise about Trump, I was very critical. And then Biden becomes president. There is the absolute cock-up of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I wrote some blistering, articles about how appallingly handled it had been. And then people say, oh, so Trump wasn't so bad after all. No, you're just holding people in power to account. That's our job.
Yeah, and we saw that a little bit at the DNC last week, right? When you and I were, again, critical is even the wrong word, but we were commenting on sort of some of the obvious kind of hypocrisy of, or at least it being slightly sickening to sort of see all of the people who had just invited Biden in, absolutely then decide to shower him with the most lavish praise afterwards. And that's just politics, and that's fine. But it's perfectly fine to point that out, right, as journalists. But, we got some criticism for it. And I think part of that is two things, sort of like we discussed last week. One is as politics has become more visceral for people, they become even angrier, particularly when they see people that they assume are kind of broadly on their side in one way, exercising within the media that kind of scrutiny function. And people start to feel it even more deeply because they say, as we discussed, they say and think, that side is so bad. How could you possibly apply almost any scrutiny function? Because the stakes are too high. You need to sort of get on board. And that just sits obviously very, very uncomfortably and uneasily with what you and I would understand as traditional journalistic scrutiny and function, which has to apply broadly, right? I mean, you don't have to both sides things. We're both against, ironically enough, both sidesism.
Yeah.
Sidism. But you still have to, for your own integrity, not only be seen, but actually apply that scrutiny function equally. And otherwise, you're just not doing your job.
Completely. And so, look, it's kind of funny for me, the number of times that people assume they know where I'm going to stand on any given issue. And actually, I think all of us are complex. All of us, I think unless you are a member of a political party where you sign up to a manifesto, we've all got nuanced views.
And even then, they don't agree with all of it.
Exactly. And so I just think, people have all sorts of different views. And look, I when I was at the BBC, I was very much kind of more concerned that people wouldn't try to pigeonhole or couldn't say you're a this or you're a that. I don't really care so much now. It doesn't matter as much now that we've got the freedom and liberation of doing our podcast. But at the same time, I don't think the job has changed.
No,
I think the job remains the same. That when a government introduces a policy, you say, is this working? Is it not?
But in direct answer to Oscar from Ballam's question, which is to say, how do you navigate speaking to your family and close friends about your own political views? I don't, family and close friends, I don't try and navigate it, because if they're family and close friends, one hopes, one trusts them not to sort of, try and embarrass you about something or other that you've said. I mean, if they did that, they probably wouldn't be family or close friends for very much longer, right? So I think I don't really try and navigate that at all. Probably when you meet people randomly, if you don't know them, then you might be somewhat less forthcoming in a way that probably anyone in a kind of professional way would do, right?
Yeah, so it's like when someone says to me, so how should I vote? Well, you've got to work it out.
Yeah,
up to you. Work it out. All I care about...
But I wouldn't even tell my family and close friends that. I would just say, well, do what you want.
Me neither. I just all I want, journalistically, as our job here, sitting here, is I want you to have decent information so that when you do go to vote, you're making your judgments, and everyone can make different judgments on the facts available, but that you've got decent information on which to make that judgment.
Well, the good news, John, is that the Countess is back from her summer sojourn.
She's
next
not.
week. I believe so. I believe she's en route right now, travelling
On her
somewhere through the
imperial
Auvergne.
throne.
Yeah, exactly. All the little French peasants have come out down through the road just to take off their caps and say au revoir to Madame Maitlis for another year. But the good news for us, rather than them, is that she'll be back sitting here next week.
I won't be, though. I'm going on the first holiday I've had
done
February.
a hell of a stint.
Since February.
You have done
So
a
that's
hell of a
just
stint.
shut you up, hasn't it? Thank God for that. Right, we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.